Why, hello! Welcome to another exciting episode of Critical Thinking. I think we called it Light in the Darkness because we thought that was poetic and dramatic, so that's kind of what we were going for. Now, you may recall, last time we had ethos and pathos, but there was one more.
One missing. So today we're going to talk about logos, which is probably most people's preferred method of persuasion because we love logic. And I don't know, I think we trust logic evidence more because usually it falls more into that realm of fact. And we established in that first episode, right, that we love facts because they're supposed to be objective. So I'll start by briefly going over what is logos. And then Stephen and I are going to talk about how we approach this in our different fields. We just had a conversation about how, for me, this caused an existential crisis of what logic I use
You heard
in
it
my
here
own
first.
field.
Yes.
So we'll see. It made me think too hard about my own work. So we'll see where this goes, but hopefully it makes sense. So logos is the Greek word for word. And it gives us our current term logic. Again, is that correct? I think
yes, so. It's very complicated because logos is it's used in all kinds of contexts. So for example, in the Greek church, logos is definitely word as in the word of God, as in God. Yeah. But it's also something like, it can also mean something like opinion or reason, or a very, very multifaceted term.
Oh, very cool. I didn't know it. Very cool. So that works in what we're looking at, because the way that Aristotle was using this, the man with slender calves, if you remember back, he really married together logos as both being how it is said and the logic of what is said. So the word aspect of logos does matter. So logos refers to the clarity of a message's claim, its logic, and the effectiveness of its supporting evidence. So the audience should be able to follow a clear progression of concepts backed up with reasonable and appropriate details. So for logos, yes, the evidence matters. That's part of the argument and why it's persuasive, but it's also how you have said it that ties into whether or not it's persuasive. So logos has two aspects, which I've kind of hinted at. So first is that the argument should be logical and it should be reasonable. So that comes to the evidence, right? So, there's reasonable. You said that. So there you go. Logos, reasonable.
Now we know.
So then secondly, as I've already gestured towards, it's connected to writing, language, and words. So the words that we choose, how we choose to parse out our evidence is also important because it should be logical in how it is presented to us as well. So the example I usually give is, you could say to someone, eat your spinach because I said so. So that's one argument. Or you could say, spinach is high in vitamins, calcium, and fiber, so eating it would be good for you. This would be a more logos argument. You have concrete evidence and you've presented it in a logical way, right? The premise follows the conclusion. Makes sense. So logos, both the clarity of the message, how it's written matters. Because Stephen and I have probably marked a lot of these papers. It doesn't matter how good the ideas are if you can't understand what's being said. That really detracts from the logic of the argument. But it's also the evidence itself, that it should be logical, reasonable, and make sense in how it's presented. So that's my intro. So how do you understand logos within your daily life, within your work?
Well, I think it is. I think you are right that this is the kind of reasoning that people think of most clearly when they think of reasoning.
Yes.
Right? And think of arguments that quote unquote make sense, that are sensible, that are logical. I think we should at some point touch on fallacies and such, which we can spend days on. So we should probably pick a few and talk about those.
Yeah.
But I think that is a very good example of how you can use logic and also misuse logic.
Yes.
So without getting into that too much now, there's a difference between saying, when it rains, then I get wet. It rains, therefore I get wet, and that is perfectly acceptable. And saying, if it rains, then I get wet, therefore it rains, which is actually not acceptable.
Yeah.
Logically, one is valid and the other is not.
Yeah.
And again, that's something we'll get to. But that also goes to show how, with just manipulation of a very small facet of what you are saying, you can say something that sounds very valid, but when you actually look at the proper logic of it, it's not. And I think sometimes.
So again, the wordplay.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So again, the wordplay, the words themselves become very important. Yeah.
Because the words don't really change in that example, right? With rain and wetness, but it's the order in which they're put that makes them one acceptable and the other not acceptable.
Yeah. So then going from, so when we talked about ethos or even pathos, we talked about, someone's character, adding to it. So what kind of character someone has, whether it's for the public good, would be what would help make something more persuasive. Whereas with logos, it's the type of evidence that's used. It's the evidence itself that is adding to that effectiveness, the persuasion. So for you, again, in your work, in your daily life, what kind of evidence would you say you most come across or you most value when it comes to a logos argument?
For me, as a psychologist, we are brought up, educationally speaking, very much in an experimentalist tradition. So for psychological science, very often we would like to see evidence coming forth from an experiment. And to do an experiment, you need to do certain things. So now this is easily a 2-hour lecture on what an experiment is, but very, very briefly. You could say an experiment is a type of research in which you manipulate something and in which you measure something, but also in which you typically have a control condition. Otherwise, there are other things like quasi-experiments, but let's not get into that. So a very concrete example. Imagine, and this is, well, I can make it psychological. Imagine that I have a new type of therapy that I have developed, and I think that's a very effective therapy that will treat depression very well, right? Of course, what I could do is I could measure someone's depression level, and then I could give my new theory, and then I could measure their depression level again. And then I may find that those people's depression has gone down, right? That they are now less depressed. But from a methodological perspective, that is a very poor experiment, because there are all kinds of what we call confounds that could explain why, in fact, someone's depression has gone down. Maybe it was the mere passage of time, right? That they just happened to become a little less depressed over time. Yeah. Or maybe it was the fact that they were talking to someone and just talking helped, right? So from an experimentalist perspective, what is missing there is a control condition. What if I would take people who are all about equally depressed, I measure their depression, I give half of them my new therapy, and I give half of them something else, another type of therapy, or something that is, I don't know, creativity therapy, something that is not really what I'm doing, but something that's also not entirely unrelated. And of course, I could also do 3 things, my therapy and an established therapy and something kind of unrelated. Anyway, the point is, if I now compare at the end, let's say the improvement in depressed symptoms between those people who received the new therapy and those people who had the control therapy, which I don't expect to really improve their depressive symptoms. And now I see that after my revolutionary new therapy, people are less depressed. That would be a much more convincing argument, because now I can show it's not the passing of time, it's not talking to other people, or any of the host of other confounds you can come up with, because I have a control condition, I have something to compare those people to. So for us, that would make the argument I think, a lot more plausible and would make us put more weight on the argument. Of course, that's not something we have to get in now. There are better experiments and there are worse experiments. But let's assume that someone has done a proper experiment like that, and then I think we'd be in business, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. So that then speaks to, I think, why a lot of really good scientific research takes so much time, and why maybe a lot of people are frustrated right now with a lot of the COVID research, that we want answers right now, but really to be doing the proper kind of evidence-based experiments, it needs to be repeated, have all these controlled measures.
Yeah, and you want to make sure that I think that's an excellent example. You want to make sure that what you found, because even if you have a control condition, what if your experiment gave specific results merely due to chance? Well, that's why you also do statistics, but even then, it would be very nice if someone would replicate that. For example, it would be great if we had a vaccine next month, but if it turns out that 5 years after taking that, everyone who took it dies, that would be rather a shame, right? So that's clearly an extreme example, but something like that does require a lot of time. That's true.
Yeah. Would you have any, because I think this is a lot of the logos kind of arguments that we're seeing in our mass media right now. I don't know if, I just thought of this right now, so I don't know if you have an answer tip of your tongue. Would you have tips for people that whenever they hear about experiments being run, whether it's COVID, whether it's whatever, are there any key things that you should be looking for in that article to help you measure whether it is that kind of ethical, logical, reasonable evidence that's being used?
Yeah, I would say so. There are a couple of things. So one thing that I would definitely do if you find it interesting, the first thing that I always want to see is who said this.
Yes.
Not because scientists are infallible, because they're not. But there is a difference between, let's stick to the COVID example, there is a difference between a research institution, let's make this really extreme, at Harvard finding that there is, or whatever, Johns Hopkins, like something that publishes medical data.
Yeah.
You would expect that certain quality standards are upheld there, right? Versus your neighbor running an experiment in a Petri dish in the garage and then saying, well, I found the cure for COVID. Like, I mean, that could be a very sensitive experiment that the person performed, but I would still be a bit more skeptical in that regard. The second thing for me that I always like to look at is experiments like these are published in scientific journals, and scientific journals have an impact factor. And an impact factor is somewhat complicated to compute, but it boils down to something like how often have other people cited the research from this specific scientific journal. And the higher the number is, the higher the impact. And this you can
cited, and just to break that down just a little bit more, just for her viewers, and then cited means that means that other researchers, anyone, this is how many times that research has showed up in another source, right?
Exactly.
Anytime it's been
these,
quoted.
no, that's a very good addition. And of course, these numbers are aggregated because if I publish something tomorrow, that will not be cited the day after tomorrow because it will take time before other researchers pick this up. But if you collect this data for a long time, you can compute sort of a cumulative number to see typically if some experiment is published in this scientific journal, how quickly will it be picked up? How many other people will also like mention this research in their own research? So that's something I would like to see because there is a massive amount of variation in the quality, even of scientific journals. For example, you may not be aware of that, but there are journals, like these are the top journals, Science or Nature, they reject almost everything. So what ends up in there typically is extremely high quality research. But there also are journals that accept almost everything. There even are journals that will accept everything as long as you pay the publishing costs. So if something would be published in a journal like that, then I would not necessarily, even if it seems like a proper experiment at first glance, I would not necessarily be super convinced by that.
Yeah. That's related to that's related to a lot of what I depend on as well, which made me have this realization that with logos, I also rely on ethos, character, quite a bit when considering who is writing it and where it's coming from. That it's similar. It's similar in the field of English or just generally cultural studies. That there's certain journals that are more rigorous in what they accept. So then I will be more open to believing and reading what's being said in that journal, as opposed to, yes, one of those journals where if you pay a fee, you're going to be published. We don't have the impact matrix in the same way. But sometimes it really depends on the database, right? Who's tracking the citations. But what it becomes more is I'm looking at who wrote it, what are their qualifications, what is the journal. But this takes place in psychology as well, obviously. But is it a peer-reviewed journal? So yes. These are journals where technically anyone can submit to any journal anywhere, right? Anyone out there, if you want to submit to Harvard's Medical Review, you can do that. What then happens is everything that is submitted goes through a panel of experts who then read it and determine whether or not it is a logical argument, whether the evidence is sound. And then these peer reviewers will make a recommendation to the publisher about whether or not to publish it. So these peer reviewers are very much the gatekeepers to make sure that whatever is going to then be published is verifiable, is ethical, is actually, I don't know what the word is I'm looking for. I don't know.
Well, uphold certain standards.
Yes.
Standards. And
yes.
that is very important. I just myself had a paper rejected. I think it's kind of interesting to talk about, maybe, because I don't know, 5 or 6 authors or something, and this was something from my postdoc. So after I did my PhD, and we submitted it, and I thought it was pretty cool, but it was it was rejected flat out because the reviewers said, and I will say, I fully agree. Like, it's been a couple of years, I looked at this, but you have like 11 participants, and I'm like, yeah, you know what? Because I started out with a database of 30 participants. A lot of the data was noisy. I had to throw out a lot. It was only an exploratory study, really, where we showed some new methods how to analyze something. But I wasn't even upset. In fact, I can actually say this. I was glad, because I thought, you know what?
Better, right?
They're right. They're right. And this is why science, proper science, is a self-correcting measure, right? Your peers say, what are you doing? No, this is not acceptable. You cannot, at the very least, you cannot draw the conclusions you drew on this small sample size. And I think if you're a good scientist, you say, yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah. We'll have to revise this.
Yeah, it's the same in my field as well. It gives you the opportunity to then correct your work. And then I would say, at least from my experience, even if you are then accepted, it then goes through a revision process, right? That then you have multiple editors going through everything with a fine-tooth comb, asking you to make changes to, again, meet those standards. And again, because I'm in English, this can come down to a single word. I'm always willing to change anything. I don't care, but it coming down to a word use, right? Of, is this the best word that you can be using to communicate what you're saying? So that's why, for me, where it's being published, who is publishing it, has a huge impact for me, because I know the certain standards that are being met within those certain publications. And I think that's the same for non-scholarly sources as well. So any kind of news sources that you're coming from. I'm also, depending on what news outlet is putting something out, I'm going to be skeptical, less skeptical, based on who is putting it out, because of what kind of reputation they have for fact checking. If they're showing their work, that's always a really big sign to me, especially if they are quoting more scientific things, but then they never name the researcher, the university, don't have any links to the study. one of my tips is if you can never, if you can't trace back to the original source from that news article, no matter what it is, that's a red flag for you of it's probably not very trustworthy in what it's presenting.
Exactly. And a lot of, I fully agree, because you read these kinds of things often along the lines of research has shown that. And then my first question is always, okay,
What research?
which research? Show me,
Yeah.
show me the paper, show me the link, show me the people.
Yeah.
And I think if you're a proper scientist, you have a certain level of skepticism. So it's a natural response for scientists to think, okay, well, this is an odd claim. I want to see this. But also bear in mind that when you then see the paper, you may also think, yeah, no, they were right, actually, that this is a solid experiment. That's fine. Yeah. But to have that skepticism and to not just believe something because it was published, because even these top journals that I was talking about, Science and Nature, occasionally have errata and people coming back and, you know what, this was an experiment. We couldn't replicate it. So lucky shot that time.
Yeah.
So even there, you have that, right? And that I think is an important aspect of your critical thought as well. Skepticism is healthy, but doubting everything and being unwilling to come back to your doubts and say, you know, this is not something I expected that anyone would find, but they did, and it seems pretty solid. So sure. Let's accept it. It's also part of science, and also part of critical thought.
Yeah, well, being able to fact check for my fields, and I take this with me into all the kinds of media that I then consume, is because obviously I'm talking about texts. So usually when I'm reading something, all the evidence that someone is using has to be directly related to what they're actually talking about. It has to follow the premise in a logical way, but also they need to stay internal to that text, right? They can't be making arguments about that text that actually don't take place in that text. So you have to stay internal to it. So I see this with a lot of, because I love cultural studies, I love pop culture. So I do a lot of reading online, right, about reviews or whatever that's on pop culture, on the new movie, whatever. But even that, when I'm trying to decide whether it's making this kind of logical argument of, are they actually talking about the film, the text, the cultural event that's happened, or do they end up getting swayed down this kind of like rabbit hole that has nothing to do with what they're actually talking about? So are they actually staying focused on the matter at hand? Do what they bring up actually, does it actually happen within that text? So being able to actually support whatever arguments are being made by the text or by whatever artifact they're actually looking at is also important. See this in news, right? If the people start reporting on something that someone has said, say it's a prime minister's address to the nation that morning, that they'll start putting words in that person's mouth that weren't actually said, but you're implying things, or you're kind of shoehorning things in. So you need to stay focused on what actually happened, and what actually is presented to you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think it's a matter of whatever you are reading about has to be relevant to the context in which it is presented.
Yeah.
And I think often it's not. And I think we live in a day and age where things are taken out of context very easily and very quickly, because there's sound bites and YouTube clips and all kinds of things that you can very easily just take out of context completely, and that can lead to dramatic results.
Yeah. Well, see, I'm wearing my Hamlet shirt. I was doing Hamlet lectures, online lectures today, but something I do with my students, right? Even when I'm teaching Hamlet, is I do bring up that, it's debated about whether or not Hamlet's feelings for Ophelia, is he really in love with her, or was he really just, lusting after her and then using her as a pawn? That there is readings for both of that, but you need to be able to point to specific things in the text to then defend whatever your view is, to defend what your argument is, of your analysis of that. So you need to be able to concretely point to something.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah. Yeah.
This makes sense. Now, the real question is, how do we summarize this?
How to summarize. So when you're looking at logos, don't forget that how it is presented to you is also important. So whether it's a spoken speech or it's something that's written, the clarity of how it is delivered is part of logos. So if it's uncomprehendable because of how it's presented to you, it could have all the, I don't know, the best evidence in the world, and it wouldn't be persuasive because we can't understand what it's saying. And then it comes down to types of evidence, of what evidence are they using. So if ethos is about character, about the public good, that's the evidence that they're using. Pathos is about drawing on our emotions. Logos is about that kind of concrete evidence and reasoning to make an argument. Oh, my dog's upset. Did you hear him?
Yeah, he needs you. Yeah.
He's making a pathos argument right now.
You see how effective it is. Just by watching your face, we can all see how effective that was.
Very persuasive. Very persuasive. Anything else that you would add to?
No, I think that's a very good way to put it. To put it, yeah. Look at the way something is put. Look at who's putting it, where it's put.
Yeah.
Whether it's relevant to what you are reading about. Yeah, I think that's very good.
Okay. And then probably, I think the next logical step would be to move on to logical.
Like how you slipped that in, yeah.
So I don't know. Hopefully we'll do logical fallacies next. I love logical fallacies. That should be fun.
Yeah, I think so too, because that is something where you can, sometimes people are amazed at how incredibly powerful a fallacy can sound and how convincing it can be, but it's logically completely incorrect and invalid.
Yeah.
So,
and I at least for me in my own education, once I became aware of different types, you then just see them everywhere.
yes.
So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So let's do that next.
Okay. Yay.
I like it. All right. Thank you all very much. We shall see you next time.